Hello, my name's Andrew, and today we're doing a first impressions review of the vivobarefoot PRIMUS Trail Knit SG. So this is a lightweight barefoot shoe for hiking and trail running, and it's very similar to Vivo's FG version, but it just has a little bit more aggressive tread. So yeah, let's check it out. Up front, you've got a nice wide toe box, and it's got the knit upper, which has some good stretch to it, but it's a medium material in terms of thickness, so it does have some resistance to scratches and tear outs from thorns and things like that, which is important for trails. You can also see that it's got some perforation here, especially when you flex the shoe. You can see the holes kind of open up, and that creates a little bit more airflow. I think the original PRIMUS Trail, which has a mesh upper, is going to be a little bit more breathable for hot weather, and generally a knit material is a little bit better for cooler weather or even colder weather down to freezing, but it can work pretty well for hot weather as well. Especially if you use a pair of toe socks. I use Injinjis. These are merino wool, so it breathes really well. It wicks moisture away from your body. And the separate toes also create a little space between your toes so that you can get some airflow in there. Also, you've got some solid protection around the front. There's two layers. There's the top layer, and then there's the front guard. This is a little bit less flexible, so it's meant to protect you from hitting your toes against stones. And then the top is a little bit more meant for protecting it against scrapes, and you want this to be more flexible because it is running along the side of your foot. I do feel a little bit of pressure here on the side. I think it's just because the angle is a little bit more inwards. I think if Vivo kind of like made the angle go up slightly, I think it would improve the feeling of it, but because it's a stretchy material that has a lot of bend to it, it didn't really seem to bother me, especially when I went outside and it was warmer. It was like in the 70s, and this rubber responds to temperature, just gets more soft kind of feeling and more flexible. In terms of the lacing, these have Vivo's drawstring system, and I don't know why, but they always seem to give you way too much lace, or at least in my opinion, but it's probably because I have more medium width feet, so people with wider feet might actually like the more lace, or the longer lace. But yeah, it's really easy to pull off here like that, but it does hold well. And on the end, they've got this little nib here, so I'm not crazy about this system. I wish that there was a hook or something like that, which they do have on the Modus Flex, which I just reviewed the other day, but it works pretty well. All you have to do is just tuck it into the top lace like that. You can put it in twice if you want to, if you have extra lace left over. And essentially, because it's a slip-on shoe, it's really easy to put your heel straight in here. It's kind of like curved out the back, and then they've got a pull tab here. And because of that, you basically never need to touch the laces after you set them up for the first time. So it's, I don't know, it doesn't really matter what they do for the lace system, honestly, for their slip-on shoes like this. It feels really comfortable around the ankle with this material. It's very stretchy. It's quite thin, so it doesn't really rub at all. You've got a pull tab in the back if you need it, but usually I just kind of grip on there. They've also added some double lining in the heel, which is important because a lot of times, especially for a slip-on shoe, if you're going in and out like that, you can wear down the back. So there's also a little bit of padding right here where your heel sits. So the lockdown's really good, even though it is a slip-on shoe. And it's just very convenient for being able to whip it on and off on the trails when you've got a stone in there. In terms of the design, this is the JJF version. So whenever they do one of these collaborations with John Florence, they come up with something really interesting for the visual details. And for this one, the color is called bone brown, which is really fitting because they've got all of these flecks here all over the shoe, which looks kind of like an archaeological dig. I feel like these are the shoes that Indiana Jones would wear if he picked up trail running, you know? I think also, I like that the rubber guard here is like translucent. You can see that, you can like see the fabric underneath it, which is kind of cool. And then the fabric's also poking out of these little holes here, which I don't know, it just feels more natural. It feels like something that belongs out in the wild, you know? In terms of the sole, it is 7.5 millimeters, so it sounds like it's a bit thicker, but actually, as you can see, there's a ton of flexibility to it. And the reason for that is that the lugs are 5 millimeters, so quite thick and aggressive, but then the midsole itself is only 2.5 millimeters. So what happens is you just get a ton of flex, and you get a lot of ground feel coming through here still, even though the overall thickness of the shoe is a little bit more. These chevron lugs that are pointed like this, they're really great for gripping going up hills, and then they're angled in the opposite direction on your heel for going downhill to hold you from sliding down. So this is the SG sole, and it's basically meant for soft ground. It's really, really good on mud or like loose dirt or anything like that, where you're going on really steep hills where Vivo's kind of more medium FG sole isn't gonna do it in terms of grip. And then one last thing about the upper is that Vivo has these flat eyelets here, which hold the drawstring really well. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about just being able to set it once and then never having to worry about it again. Okay, and finally, one last note about the sole. Because the lugs are more spaced apart, they don't have as much surface area, so they can wear down faster on hard surfaces like rocks and gravel and roads. So I would say with this shoe, you probably want to do maybe about 25% firm ground and 75% soft ground. It handles, you know, going on roads perfectly fine. You can feel the lugs just a little bit, and it's not something that bothers me, but if it does bother you, then you can use Vivo's thin insole that they give. It just gives a little bit of padding. If you put this in, you basically won't feel the lugs at all. Another good option would be the Vivo Barefoot PRIMUS Trail Knit FG, and this is essentially the same thing, but with the FG sole. So you got the same wide toe box, the stretchy knit upper, the drawstring system, and then the slip-on back. But in terms of the tread, it's 5.5 millimeters. So it's still got some really good flexibility to it, but it just feels a little more firm overall, a little bit more protective for rocks and roads and gravel, stuff like that. This is probably Vivo Barefoot's most versatile sole because you can use it for basically everything. It will work for soft ground as long as it's not too steep and slippery. So there is a bit of depth to the tread there, but the midsole is slightly thicker, so it gives you a little bit more protection than the SG, which is very thin for the midsole and then has those deeper lugs on it. And the lugs are a little bit closer together, so like I said, this will wear better on gravel and roads and anything that might beat up a shoe that has more space in it, like the SG. Also, if you want something lighter, this is the Frehgle, and it's got the same type of wide toe box with a stretchy knit upper, but it's actually made from recycled bottle yarn, which is cool. And it's hard to see, but underneath the top layer, there's also a water-resistant membrane, and it's really good for going through wet grass or mud or puddles and things like that, especially when it's colder, when you don't want your feet to be wet. The upper is a little bit more flexible. It feels like a sock, but there's not as much support as there is with the Vivos that we looked at. So one thing that I found that helps is just adding the insole that they give you. It just takes up a little more room in the shoe. It's got some cupping on the side and it prevents your foot from sliding, especially because the bottle yarn tends to be just a little bit more slippery. So when you add that insole in, it just gives you more texture here. And then because it is a shoe that's meant for wet conditions, I find the perforation on this insole to work really well too. And what happens essentially is that the moisture kind of goes underneath the insole so that you're not like squishing down on it, you know, like I hate that feeling. Most people don't like to feel like that. So I find the insole to be really useful. In terms of the sole, it's 7.5 millimeters. So basically the same as the Vivo SG, but it's set up a little bit differently because the tread here is closer together and the lugs are also a little bit wider. So it's a more versatile sole in terms of terrain because you can take it on roads and rocks and gravel and it's perfectly fine versus something like Vivo's SG sole, which is a little bit more aggressive and meant for mostly wet terrain. But I will say that it gives you a bit less ground feel because the lugs are more dense and I could kind of feel them in the shoe. So this is one where I felt like I had to add the insole in there just to give myself some padding because the lugs did feel a little bit harder and, you know, more clunky. So it does take a little bit of ground feel away and it is a slightly more padded insole. So if you add this in, you're getting more towards like 10.5 millimeters. So that's something to consider between the two shoes. Okay, and then one last note about the upper is that because it has the membrane in there, it tends to be just a little less breathable for hot weather versus the knit. Finally, we've got the Vivo Barefoot Magnalite water resistant soft ground. And this is a similar shoe to the Knit SG, except it has a higher upper to it. It's got this really flexible collar, which feels nice. It's got a wide toe box as well. I think maybe even just a little bit more room than the knit version, although not quite as stretchy because it's got a water resistant synthetic material here with ripstop as well, which is nice because what that does is that they can make the water resistant lining a little bit thinner and more breathable, but then also more resistant to tear outs. You've got the same type of minimal reinforcement on the top for some protection, then obviously the thicker toe guard, which is nice for ramming your toes up against rocks. A little bit different lacing system here, although it still holds perfectly fine. I honestly find that I don't even need to tighten these shoes because you've got this like stretchy collar here and it's a little bit taller, so it holds your foot really well. It's very easy to just like slip on and off even though it is taller. One thing that I don't like as much about this shoe is these supports here. They're kind of necessary because you don't get as much support from the flexible upper, but I find that it just creates just a little bit of pressure right here on your ankle. So sometimes I'll wear 2 layers of socks, like thin and gingies with these, and that definitely helps. And it's not a major issue, but it's just something to note. You do have more reinforcement around the back as well, which is important for preventing heel tear outs. And then in terms of the sole, it's 7.5 millimeters, so it's the same SG sole with some really good flexibility to it despite being thicker. And then those really aggressive lugs in the front for going up hills, and then different direction in the back for going down hills. And it's the same thing where I would probably do 75% wet and kind of loose dirt type terrain, and then maybe only 25% roads and rocks and things like that. In terms of the water resistance, it's not completely waterproof, but it is great for wet grass and kind of like medium puddles and stuff like that. The water can splash up here, so if you're in like a deeper puddle, that's probably something that I would avoid. But yeah, in general, they're very breathable. They dry quite quickly just because the fabric is so thin. All right, so that's my first impression of the Vivo Barefoot Primus Trail Knit SG and friends. But if you'd like to support the channel, you can use the code FULTY10 for 10% off Vivo Barefoot. Browse and filter more products on my website, barefootwear.org, or watch my zero drop transition video to learn more about barefooting. Finally, if you have a question about the Vivo Barefoot Primus Trail Knit SG or about barefoot shoes in general, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Peace.